I had been living in my son's guest room for a year, after a health scare made it difficult for me to live alone at 76 years old. Then my daughter-in-law's father needed a place to stay, and my son knocked on my door with guilt in his eyes. He said his father-in-law needed my room because he was going through hard times, and family comes first. I asked what about me, because I'm family too. My son drove me to a homeless shelter with 2 suitcases and left me there while his father-in-law moved into my bed. But what I did next destroyed everything he had. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. I raised my son completely alone from the time he was 9 years old after his mother died suddenly from cancer that took her in less than 6 months. I became both parents to him overnight, trying to fill a role I wasn't prepared for while grieving the loss of my wife. I worked myself to absolute exhaustion, building a successful manufacturing business from the ground up so my son could have every advantage and opportunity I never had growing up poor. I missed his school plays and baseball games because I was working late, trying to land new clients and grow the company. I sacrificed my health and my personal life and any chance of remarrying because all my energy went into providing for my son and building something that would secure both our futures. I put him through business school at an expensive private university, paying full tuition without loans so he could graduate debt-free. I made him vice president of my company when he was only 28 years old, giving him a 6-figure salary and real authority over operations. I set him up financially beyond what most young men his age could ever dream of having. He drove luxury cars and lived in a nice apartment and took expensive vacations, all funded by the business I'd built with my own hands. I gave him everything I possibly could because that's what fathers do for their sons. That's what I thought family meant. When he married Amanda 3 years ago, I welcomed her and her entire family with open arms. I paid for a significant portion of their wedding because her family couldn't afford the kind of celebration she wanted. I helped them with the down payment on their house because they didn't have enough saved up on their own. I treated Amanda like the daughter I never had, trying to make her feel loved and accepted into our family. I believed we would all be one big happy family unit supporting each other through life's challenges. I thought my generosity and love would be returned when I eventually needed help myself. I was completely wrong about everything. My relationship with my son had always been strong up until he married Amanda. We'd been a team for so many years after his mother died. Just the two of us against the world, building a life together. But after the wedding, things started changing in ways I didn't fully recognize at first. Amanda had opinions about how the business should be run, even though she had no experience in manufacturing. She had opinions about how my son should spend his time, suggesting he was working too much and needed to prioritize their marriage over the company. She had opinions about me and my role in their lives, making comments about how I was too involved or too present. I moved into their guest room about a year ago after I had a serious health scare that landed me in the hospital for a week. The doctors said I shouldn't be living alone anymore at my age because I needed someone nearby in case of emergency. My son insisted I move in with them, saying they had plenty of space and wanted to take care of me. Amanda seemed supportive at first, agreeing that family takes care of family. I thought this arrangement would work out well for everyone. I'd be safe and cared for. They'd have help around the house since I could still do light tasks and yard work. We'd spend quality time together as a family. It seemed like the perfect solution. But I should have seen the signs that Amanda resented my presence in their home. The way she'd sigh when I'd join them for dinner. The way she'd make comments about needing more privacy as a couple. The way she'd suggest I should look into senior living facilities where I'd have more activities and social interaction with people my own age. I ignored these hints because I didn't want to believe my daughter-in-law wanted me gone. I didn't want to believe my son would choose his wife's comfort over his father's well-being. I was naive about what was coming. 2 months ago, Amanda made an announcement over dinner that caught me completely off guard. She said her father was going through some serious financial troubles and needed a place to stay temporarily while he got back on his feet. Apparently, he'd made some bad investments and lost a significant amount of money. He was facing eviction from his apartment and had nowhere else to go. Amanda was very emotional, talking about how worried she was about her father and how family needs to help each other during difficult times. My son nodded along supportively, saying, of course they would help her father, and he could stay with them as long as he needed. I was living in their guest room at the time, like I had been for the past year. I'd been there since my health scare made living alone too dangerous at 76 years old. The guest room had become my space with my belongings and my furniture and my routine. I assumed when Amanda said her father would be staying with them that they'd figure out some arrangement that worked for everyone. Maybe he could sleep on the couch temporarily. Maybe they'd convert their home office into a bedroom. Maybe they'd help him find a small apartment nearby that they could help pay for. I never imagined what they were actually planning. 3 days after that dinner, my son knocked on my guest room door in the evening. I could tell from his face that something was wrong. He had that guilty, uncomfortable expression people get when they're about to deliver bad news they don't want to deliver. He came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed and couldn't quite make eye contact with me. Then he said words that felt like a physical punch to my chest. "Dad, we need to talk about the living situation. Amanda's father needs a place to stay, and this is the only available room in the house. He's going through a really hard time right now, and we need to prioritize family." I stared at my son in confusion, not quite understanding what he was saying. "What about me?" I asked. "I'm living in this room. I've been here for a year. Where am I supposed to go?" My son still couldn't look directly at me as he explained their plan. "We found you a place at Meadowbrook Senior Shelter. It's a really nice facility with meals and activities and other people your age. Amanda thinks it might actually be better for you to be around more people, instead of isolated here with just us. Her father really needs this room, and it's just temporary until he gets back on his feet financially. Maybe a few months at most." I felt like I was having a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. My son was telling me I needed to move out of his house and into a homeless shelter so his father-in-law could have my room. "This is temporary for him but permanent for me?" I asked, trying to understand the logic. "I'm your father. I raised you alone after your mother died. I built the business that pays for this house. And you're choosing Amanda's father over me?" My son got defensive, saying I was making this harder than it needed to be. He said Amanda's father had nowhere else to go. He said the shelter was a perfectly fine place for seniors who needed temporary housing. He said I'd be comfortable there and they'd visit me regularly. I was too shocked to argue effectively in that moment, too hurt to find the right words to express how betrayed I felt. My son stood up and said we'd move my things to the shelter in 2 days to give me time to pack. Then he left my room, closing the door behind him. I sat there on my bed in complete disbelief, trying to process that my only son was about to put me in a homeless shelter so his wife's father could have my room. The man I'd sacrificed everything for was choosing his in-laws over his own father, who'd given him every opportunity in life. 2 days later, my son drove me to Meadowbrook Senior Shelter in his expensive car that I'd helped him buy. We loaded my belongings into his trunk, which consisted of 2 suitcases containing everything I owned that mattered. Most of my furniture and belongings had been donated or stored when I moved into their guest room a year ago. Now, even those few remaining possessions felt like too much as I watched my son carry my suitcases toward the entrance of a building that looked nothing like the nice facility he'd described. The paint was peeling off the exterior walls. The windows were dirty and some were cracked. The front door had a broken handle that barely closed properly. This was not a comfortable senior living facility. This was a homeless shelter. My son helped me carry my suitcases through the front door into a crowded lobby that smelled like old food and unwashed bodies and industrial cleaning products trying to mask worse odors. There were people everywhere. Old men sitting in broken chairs staring at nothing. A woman arguing loudly with someone at the front desk about meal times. The floor was dirty despite someone mopping in the corner. Everything about this place screamed desperation and poverty and failure. This was where my son was leaving his 76-year-old father who'd given him everything. We walked up to the intake desk where a tired-looking woman with a clipboard asked for my information. My son stood next to me as I answered questions about my age and health conditions and whether I had any income or assets. I lied and said I had nothing because I wasn't about to tell this stranger about money my son apparently thought belonged to him. The woman explained the rules about curfews and meals and shared bathroom schedules. She said I'd be in a room with 5 other men and we'd share one bathroom down the hall with 35 other residents. She handed me a thin blanket and a pillow that looked like it had been used by hundreds of people before me. My son carried my suitcases to the room they'd assigned me on the second floor. We walked down a hallway with flickering fluorescent lights and doors that didn't close properly. The room was small and crowded with 6 metal cots pushed against the walls. 5 men were already living there. 1 was sleeping in the middle of the day. 2 were arguing about something. Another was just sitting on his cot staring at the wall. This was where I was supposed to live while my son's father-in-law slept in my comfortable guest room. My son put my suitcases next to the one empty cot in the corner by a window that was covered in grime and wouldn't open. He looked uncomfortable and guilty standing there in his expensive clothes surrounded by poverty. "It's just temporary, Dad," he said again, like repeating those words would make this situation acceptable. "Amanda's father will probably be back on his feet in a few months, and then we can figure out something better for you. This place isn't so bad. You'll make friends here and they have activities during the day." I looked at my son and didn't even recognize the man standing in front of me. This wasn't the boy I'd raised alone after his mother died. This wasn't the young man I'd put through college and made vice president of my company. This was a stranger who'd been completely taken over by his wife and her family's needs. "How long are you planning to leave me here?" I asked quietly. He shifted uncomfortably and said again that it was temporary. "Maybe a few months. Maybe longer depending on his father-in-law's situation. He said he'd send me money for necessities and visit when he could." Then he hugged me quickly in an awkward embrace that lasted maybe 3 seconds. He said he had to get going because Amanda's father was arriving at the house that afternoon and they needed to get his room set up properly. He walked out of that shelter, leaving me standing next to a cot with 2 suitcases containing everything I owned, while his father-in-law prepared to move into my room in a house I'd helped them buy. Meadowbrook was absolutely nothing like the nice facility my son had described when he was convincing me to leave his house. This wasn't some comfortable senior living community with activities and social programs and decent accommodations. This was a legitimate homeless shelter for indigent elderly men who had nowhere else to go and no family willing to take them in. I was 76 years old and I'd built a successful manufacturing business from nothing, and now I was sleeping on a metal cot in a crowded room with 5 strangers who'd lost everything in their lives. The humiliation was almost unbearable. The room I'd been assigned to had 6 cots pushed as close together as possible to maximize the number of people they could fit in a small space. There was barely 2 feet between each cot, which meant 0 privacy and constant noise from the other men. One of my roommates snored so loudly every night that sleep was nearly impossible. Another one talked to himself, constantly mumbling about things that made no sense. A third one had some kind of medical condition that made him cough violently throughout the night. The smell in that room was terrible. A mixture of unwashed bodies and old clothes and desperation that no amount of air freshener could cover. We shared one bathroom down the hall with 35 other men living on our floor. One bathroom for 35 people. The line in the morning was ridiculous, with men waiting sometimes 30 minutes just to use the toilet or take a shower. The shower had no privacy curtain, and the water was either scalding hot or ice cold with no in-between. The toilet was constantly clogged because the plumbing was old and couldn't handle the usage. The sink barely worked, and there was never enough soap or toilet paper. I'd gone from having my own private bathroom in my son's guest room to sharing one disgusting facility with dozens of strangers. The meals at the shelter were barely edible. Breakfast was watery oatmeal or stale cereal with milk that tasted sour. Lunch was mystery meat sandwiches or soup that was mostly water with a few vegetables floating in it. Dinner was usually some kind of casserole made from the cheapest ingredients possible, cooked in quantities that sacrificed any flavor or nutrition. Everything was served on plastic trays in a crowded dining hall that was loud and chaotic. I'd sit there eating food that wouldn't be acceptable to feed dogs while thinking about my son's father-in-law eating home-cooked meals in a kitchen I'd helped furnish. The noise in that shelter was constant and overwhelming, making sleep nearly impossible even when I was exhausted. People arguing at all hours, TVs blaring in common areas, staff members yelling instructions, doors slamming, someone always having some kind of crisis or breakdown. The chaos never stopped. I'd lie on my thin cot at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to my roommates snore and cough and talk in their sleep while trying to process how my life had come to this point. How had I gone from successful business owner to homeless shelter resident because my son chose his father-in-law over his own father? Every morning, I'd wake up on that uncomfortable cot with my back aching and my mind foggy from lack of proper sleep. I'd wait in line for the bathroom. I'd eat the terrible breakfast they served. I'd spend the day sitting in the common area or walking around the neighborhood trying to fill the endless empty hours. Other residents would try to talk to me, asking about my story and how I ended up there. I'd make up vague explanations because I was too ashamed to tell them the truth. That my son, who I'd raised alone and put through college and made wealthy, had dumped me in this place so his wife's father could have my room. Meanwhile, I knew my son's father-in-law was sleeping in my bed, using my furniture, eating meals my daughter-in-law prepared in their nice kitchen, watching TV in their comfortable living room, living in the space that should have been mine while I suffered in this hellhole. And my son was fine with that arrangement. He'd chosen his in-laws over his own father without hesitation. What my son didn't know, or had conveniently forgotten in his eagerness to please his wife, was that the manufacturing business I'd supposedly retired from 3 years ago still had me listed as the primary owner and sole executor of all corporate accounts. I had given him operational control of the day-to-day business and a very generous salary that allowed him to live his comfortable lifestyle. But I had never actually transferred legal ownership of the company or its assets to him, because I'd always planned to do that through proper estate planning when the time was right. I wanted to make sure everything was set up correctly for tax purposes and to protect the business from any potential problems. That decision to wait on the ownership transfer was about to become the most important decision I'd ever made. The business had $8 million sitting in various accounts and investments that were all legally registered in my name alone. There was $3.2 million in the main business operating account that funded payroll and operations and vendor payments. There was $2.8 million in investment portfolios I'd built up over the years as the company's profit reserves. There was another $2 million from the recent sale of a commercial property the business had owned that I'd never bothered mentioning to my son because I handled all the major financial decisions. All of it was legally mine. Not his. Mine. My name was on every account. My signature was required for any major transactions. I was still the owner on paper, even if my son thought he was running the show. My son had apparently assumed at some point that I'd transferred everything to him already, or that it would automatically become his when I died, or that his operational control meant he owned the company. He'd gotten comfortable spending money from accounts he thought were under his control. He'd been making decisions about investments and purchases, assuming the money was his to manage. He'd even told people he owned the business when introducing himself at networking events. But legally, none of that was true. He was an employee with a fancy title and a big salary. I was still the owner with complete control over every dollar. I had deliberately kept my financial situation private even from my son because I'd grown up poor and learned early that people treat you differently when they know you have money. I'd always lived modestly despite the business success. I drove regular cars instead of luxury vehicles. I lived in a normal house instead of a mansion. I didn't flash wealth or brag about money. Most people, including my son, probably assumed the business was doing okay, but not spectacularly well. They had no idea about the millions sitting in accounts or the real estate holdings or the investment portfolios that had grown substantially over the years. When my son put me in that shelter, he was apparently thinking I was just a retired old man with maybe some Social Security income and a small pension. He wasn't thinking about the fact that I still legally owned the entire business that funded his lifestyle. He wasn't considering that every dollar he spent came from accounts that required my authorization. He wasn't remembering that the house he'd given my room away in was partly funded by money I'd given him from business profits that I controlled. He'd gotten so comfortable with his comfortable life that he'd forgotten where it all actually came from. Sitting in that shelter on those first few nights, lying on my thin cot, surrounded by men who'd lost everything, I started thinking about those $8 million in accounts my son thought he controlled. I started thinking about the legal paperwork that showed me as the sole owner. I started thinking about how easy it would be to move that money somewhere my son couldn't touch it. I started thinking about what kind of lesson my son needed to learn about family loyalty and gratitude and taking care of the people who sacrificed everything for you. And slowly, a plan began forming in my mind that would teach him exactly what temporary hardship really feels like. I spent 7 days in that horrible shelter, and they were without question the longest and most humiliating 7 days of my entire 76 years of life. Every morning I'd wake up on that uncomfortable cot with my back aching and my dignity in shreds. Every day I'd eat terrible food and wait in lines for basic necessities and try to find places to sit where I wouldn't be bothered by other residents. Every night I'd lie awake listening to the chaos around me and planning exactly what I was going to do to my son who'd put me here. Those 7 days gave me plenty of time to think clearly about my situation and what needed to happen next. The shelter had a small computer lab with 3 ancient desktop computers that residents could use for limited amounts of time each day. I'd wait in line for my turn and then spend my allotted hour researching and making plans. I contacted my longtime lawyer Richard, who'd handled my business affairs for 20 years. I explained my situation in careful terms over email from a new account I created. I told him I needed to move substantial assets immediately, and that time was critical. Richard was shocked when I told him where I was living and what my son had done. He said he'd help me with whatever I needed and to call him from a private phone as soon as possible. I also used those computers to contact my financial advisor Susan, who managed my investment portfolios. I sent her encrypted messages through her secure client portal explaining that I needed to liquidate certain positions and move funds to new accounts. She responded quickly saying she'd start the paperwork immediately and asking if everything was okay. I told her everything was fine and I'd explain more later. I also spent time researching real estate agents and international banking options and residency programs in countries I'd always wanted to visit but never had time for when I was building the business. My son had convinced me to get off the family cell phone plan months earlier, claiming it would save money if I just got my own basic phone. At the time, I'd thought it was a reasonable suggestion. Now I realized it was probably Amanda's idea to start disconnecting me from their lives. I went to a discount store near the shelter and bought a cheap prepaid phone for $30 using cash I had in my wallet. I used that phone to make calls to Richard and Susan and several other professional contacts, having long, detailed conversations about moving money and setting up new accounts and planning an exit strategy that my son would never see coming. Every night I'd lie on that thin cot surrounded by snoring strangers, and I'd refine the plan in my head, going over every detail to make sure nothing could go wrong. I thought about which accounts to drain first. I thought about how to move the money without triggering immediate alerts. I thought about where to move it that would be safe and secure and completely out of my son's reach. I thought about timing and logistics and how to disappear completely once the money was moved. I thought about what my son's face would look like when he realized what I'd done, and that thought kept me going through those awful days. I also used the shelter's computers to research Portugal and their Golden Visa program that grants residency to people who make significant investments in the country. I'd always wanted to retire somewhere warm with beautiful coastline and good food and a slower pace of life. Portugal fit all those requirements perfectly. The Golden Visa program would let me move there immediately with my money and establish permanent residency. I could buy a beautiful apartment overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. I could live comfortably on my investments. I could disappear from my son's life completely and start fresh somewhere he'd never think to look for me. By the end of that 7th day in the shelter, I had every detail planned out perfectly. I knew exactly which accounts to access. I knew exactly where the money would go. I knew exactly when to execute the plan, and I knew my son was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. On the morning of day 8 in that shelter, I woke up early before most of the other residents and went straight to the computer lab as soon as it opened. I logged into my secure banking portals using passwords my son had never known existed. I started initiating wire transfers that would move every accessible dollar from accounts my son thought he controlled, but that were legally registered in my name. The first transfer was $3.2 million from the main business operating account that funded all the company's daily operations, including payroll and vendor payments and rent for the office space. I moved that entire amount to a new account I'd opened at an international bank that specialized in helping people relocate their wealth overseas. The second transfer was $2.8 million from the investment portfolios I'd built up over years of careful planning and smart decisions. These were stocks and bonds and mutual funds that represented the company's profit reserves and rainy day savings. My financial advisor, Susan, had already liquidated the positions per my instructions, so the cash was sitting ready to move. I transferred all of it to another new account at a different international bank in a different country to spread things out and make it harder to trace. My hands were shaking slightly as I watched the confirmation messages appear on screen, showing millions of dollars moving silently through digital channels from one place to another. The third transfer was $2 million from the recent sale of a commercial property the business had owned for years. We'd sold that property 3 months earlier to a developer who wanted to build apartments on the land. The money from that sale had been sitting in a separate account, earning interest while I figured out what to do with it. My son didn't even know about this account because I'd handled the entire property sale myself without involving him in the details. I moved every penny of it to yet another new account at a third international bank. $8 million moved silently and legally through banking systems over the course of about 2 hours while I sat in a homeless shelter computer lab. $8 million that had been funding my son's comfortable lifestyle disappeared from accounts he thought he had access to. The transfers were all completely legal because I was the registered owner of the accounts and had every right to move my own money wherever I wanted. But my son was about to discover that the money he'd been casually spending wasn't actually his at all. I also sent instructions to my lawyer, Richard, to immediately stop making the monthly payments I'd been quietly covering on my son's house mortgage. My son thought he was paying his mortgage from his salary, but the truth was, his salary wasn't quite enough to cover his expensive lifestyle and house payments both. I'd been supplementing his mortgage payments for the past 2 years without telling him to make sure he didn't lose the house. Now those supplemental payments would stop immediately. His next mortgage payment would bounce, and the one after that, and eventually the bank would start foreclosure proceedings. I sent one final set of instructions to my accountant telling him to file paperwork showing the business had insufficient operating capital and would need to declare bankruptcy. Without the $3.2 million in operating funds, there was no way to make payroll or pay vendors or keep the lights on. The business my son thought he was running would collapse within weeks once people stopped getting paid. All those employees who depended on their paychecks would be out of work. All those vendors who supplied materials would stop delivering. All those clients who had pending orders would have to go elsewhere. The entire company would implode. I logged out of all the banking portals and cleared the browser history on the computer so nobody could see what I'd been doing. I walked back to my room and started packing my 2 suitcases with the few belongings I'd brought to the shelter. I was leaving this place and leaving the country and leaving my son to deal with the consequences of choosing his father-in-law over his own father, who'd given him everything. I had my lawyer, Richard, deliver an envelope to my son at his office that same afternoon while I was already at the airport preparing to board my international flight. I'd written a letter that explained exactly what I'd done and why I'd done it and what was about to happen to his comfortable life. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't some impulsive, angry reaction, but a calculated response to his betrayal. I wanted him to know that every consequence he was about to face was a direct result of his choice to put me in a homeless shelter while giving my room to his father-in-law. I wanted the words to hit him hard and make him realize the magnitude of his mistake. The letter started simply. You left your father in a homeless shelter and gave my room to your father-in-law because he needed temporary help while I was supposedly fine there. You drove me to Meadowbrook in your expensive car and walked away, leaving me on a cot surrounded by strangers who'd lost everything. You chose Amanda's father over your own father who raised you alone and gave you every opportunity you've ever had. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I continued explaining what I'd done in clear, direct terms so there would be no confusion. I have taken the $8 million that was always legally mine from the business accounts and investment portfolios and property sales. The $3.2 million in the operating account that you thought was yours is gone. The $2.8 million in investments that funded your salary is gone. The $2 million from the commercial property sale that you didn't even know about is gone. All of it has been moved to accounts in banks you've never heard of in countries where you have no legal standing to touch it. Then I explained what would happen next, because I wanted him to understand the full scope of the disaster I was leaving behind. The business you've been running for the past 3 years is now bankrupt as of this morning. Without operating capital, there's no way to make payroll or pay vendors or fulfill client orders. Your employees will stop getting paid within days. Your vendors will stop delivering supplies. Your clients will cancel their contracts. The company that I built from nothing and handed you on a silver platter will collapse completely because you forgot who actually owned it. I also mentioned the house because I wanted him to know that safe, comfortable home where he'd given my room away was about to disappear too. The house you gave my room away in will be foreclosed within months. I've stopped making the supplemental mortgage payments I'd been quietly covering for the past 2 years. You thought you were paying your mortgage from your salary, but you weren't making enough to cover both your lifestyle and your house payment. I was covering the difference without telling you because I wanted you to feel successful. Now those payments stop and your mortgage will start bouncing, and eventually the bank will take your house. The final paragraph was the most important one because it explained what would happen to me and where I was going. Consider this my permanent relocation to a place you will never find me. I'm leaving the country today with the $8 million that was always legally mine. I'm moving somewhere warm and beautiful, where people treat the elderly with respect instead of dumping them in shelters. My phone number is disconnected. My location will remain unknown to everyone except my lawyer who has been sworn to secrecy. You will never see me again or have access to my money. I ended the letter with one final thought that summarized everything. Your father-in-law can have my old cot at Meadowbrook Senior Shelter. It's available now. Maybe he can sleep there while he gets back on his feet, since that's apparently what family does for each other according to you and Amanda. You chose your in-laws over your father who sacrificed everything for you. Now you have neither the in-laws' money nor your father's support. Some sons inherit wealth from their fathers. You inherited the lesson that family loyalty matters and betrayal has consequences. I hope my room was worth it. Richard confirmed by text that he'd delivered the envelope and that my son had opened it in his office and immediately tried calling me. But my old number was already disconnected and my new international phone number was known only to Richard and a few other trusted contacts who'd been instructed never to share it. I landed in Lisbon, Portugal, approximately 14 hours after leaving the United States with $8 million in secure international bank accounts and a one-way ticket to a new life. Portugal has a program called the Golden Visa that grants immediate residency to people who make significant investments in the country, either through real estate purchases or capital transfers into Portuguese banks. I'd already arranged everything through my lawyer Richard before I even left the shelter. I'd transferred the required investment amount into a Portuguese bank account and started the residency application process. By the time I landed in Lisbon, my Golden Visa approval was already being processed, and I had legal authorization to stay in the country permanently. I'd also arranged through a local real estate agent to rent a beautiful furnished apartment in Cascais, which is a coastal town about 30 minutes outside Lisbon. The apartment overlooked the Atlantic Ocean with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed stunning views of the water and the cliffs. It had 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and a modern kitchen and a balcony where I could sit and watch the sunset every evening. The monthly rent for this amazing apartment was less than what my son had been unconsciously spending in a single day from accounts I'd been funding. I was living in luxury on the Portuguese coast for a fraction of what my son's lifestyle had been costing. The timing of my departure was perfect because by the time my son tried to call me after reading my letter, I was already settling into my new apartment 4,000 miles away. My old phone number had been disconnected before I left the United States. My new Portuguese phone number was known only to Richard and Susan and a couple of other trusted professional contacts who'd been strictly instructed never to share my contact information with anyone, especially not my son. I'd also closed all my old email accounts and opened new ones that my son didn't know about. I'd effectively disappeared from his life completely and intentionally. Richard texted me updates about my son's reaction using our secure encrypted messaging app. He said my son had called his office 42 times that first day after receiving the letter, desperately trying to reach me or find out where I'd gone. He said my son had shown up at Richard's office demanding information about my location and the money I'd transferred. Richard had calmly explained that he couldn't share client information and that everything I'd done was completely legal since I was the registered owner of all the accounts. He said my son had threatened legal action, but Richard reminded him there was no legal case since I'd simply moved my own money. My son had apparently also contacted the bank that held his business accounts, asking them to reverse the wire transfers or freeze the accounts. But the bank explained that the account owner, which was me, had authorized all the transfers and they were completed transactions that couldn't be reversed. My son had tried contacting the international banks where I'd moved the money, but those banks wouldn't even confirm whether accounts existed due to privacy laws. He'd tried hiring a private investigator to track my location, but my trail had gone completely cold once I left the country. I spent my first week in Portugal just relaxing and decompressing from the trauma of being put in that shelter. I'd wake up in my comfortable bed with ocean views instead of on a thin cot surrounded by strangers. I'd make coffee in my modern kitchen instead of waiting in line for watery instant coffee at the shelter. I'd sit on my balcony reading books and watching the waves instead of spending my days in a crowded shelter common area. I'd take walks along the beach and explore the charming town of Cascais with its cafes and restaurants and shops. I'd eat fresh seafood and drink Portuguese wine and feel my stress slowly melting away. The weather in Portugal was perfect in a way that felt almost healing. Sunny, warm days with cool ocean breezes. No harsh winters like I'd experienced back home. The people were friendly and welcoming to foreigners. The cost of living was remarkably low compared to the United States. My $8 million would last me the rest of my life very comfortably in this beautiful place. My lawyer Richard sends me occasional updates about my son's situation, and honestly, each update confirms that he learned exactly the lesson I intended him to learn about family loyalty and gratitude and consequences. The business collapsed completely within 3 weeks, just like I knew it would once the operating capital disappeared. My son couldn't make payroll, so all 40 employees stopped showing up to work after missing 2 consecutive paychecks. Vendors stopped delivering materials once their invoices went unpaid for 30 days. Clients started canceling contracts and demanding refunds for work that couldn't be completed. The office lease went into default, and the landlord started eviction proceedings. Everything my son thought he owned or controlled vanished in less than a month. His house went into foreclosure, exactly like I predicted it would once the supplemental mortgage payments I'd been secretly making stopped coming through. The bank sent default notices after the first missed payment. Then they sent formal foreclosure warnings after the second and third missed payments. My son tried to negotiate with the bank, explaining his financial situation had suddenly changed. But banks don't care about explanations when money stops flowing. They started the legal foreclosure process and gave him 90 days to vacate the property. The house where he'd given my room to his father-in-law was being taken by the bank. Amanda's father moved out the moment the money dried up, which was both predictable and satisfying to hear about. Apparently, he'd been living quite comfortably in my old room for those few weeks, enjoying the lifestyle my money had been funding. But once my son couldn't pay the mortgage or keep food in the house or maintain the comfortable environment, the father-in-law suddenly remembered he had other options. He moved in with Amanda's sister across town, leaving my son and Amanda to deal with their collapsing life alone. So much for family helping family during hard times. Turns out the father-in-law's loyalty lasted exactly as long as the free, comfortable housing. Amanda filed for divorce about 2 months after everything collapsed, which honestly didn't surprise me at all. She'd married my son for the lifestyle and status and comfort he could provide through the business I'd built. Once that disappeared, and they were facing bankruptcy and foreclosure and real financial struggle, she wanted out immediately. She filed papers claiming irreconcilable differences, but really it was just that she couldn't handle being married to someone who wasn't wealthy anymore. She moved out, taking half of whatever assets they had left, which wasn't much, and started dating some other successful businessman within weeks. My son lost his wife, along with everything else. Last I heard from Richard, my son was living in a modest apartment in a less desirable part of town, working a regular employee job at someone else's company for a fraction of what he used to make as VP of my business. He's struggling with debt from credit cards he maxed out trying to keep things afloat before the business finally collapsed. He's driving an old used car because his luxury vehicle got repossessed when he couldn't make the payments. He's working long hours for a boss who doesn't appreciate him trying to rebuild his life from nothing. He's experiencing exactly what I experienced when I was building the business from scratch, except he doesn't have the skills or work ethic or determination to actually succeed at it. The most poetic part of all this is that he's now living the life he thought I deserved when he put me in that shelter. He's struggling financially. He's alone without family support. He's working hard just to survive. He's learning what temporary hardship actually means when nobody's there to bail you out or cover your mistakes or supplement your income. Meanwhile, I'm living in my beautiful apartment in Portugal, watching sunsets over the Atlantic Ocean, and eating fresh seafood and taking Portuguese language classes and making new friends in the expat community. I wake up every morning grateful for the life I have now. Grateful that I escaped my son's betrayal. Grateful that I taught him a lesson he'll never forget. He left me in a homeless shelter and gave my room to his father-in-law because family comes first. So I drained the $8 million in business accounts that were legally mine, moved to Portugal, and left him to learn what real hardship feels like. His business collapsed, his house foreclosed, his wife left him, and his father-in-law abandoned him the moment the money dried up. He chose his in-laws over his father. Now he has neither the in-laws, nor the wealth, nor his father. And I have a beautiful life, 4,000 miles away from the son who forgot which family raised him and gave him everything.